A lot of people don't believe in Jesus, not because they can't believe, but because they won't believe, because they refuse to. And that's been the case since the time that Jesus was walking the earth in his 3 year ministry. Consider the chief priests who knew very well that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead after Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days, after he'd already begun to have an odor. Yet they refused to acknowledge that fact. We see that in John chapter 12 quite clearly. John chapter 12, beginning in verse 9, when the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. And yet, remarkably, the chief priests didn't believe. Later on, consider the fact that the very same men, the same chief priests, not too long after that, knew Jesus had risen from the dead himself, just as he said he would, and yet they ignored the evidence and simply tried to cover it up. Matthew chapter 28, as a matter of fact. Matthew chapter 28, beginning in verse 1, we read, "Now, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb, and behold, there was a great earthquake. For an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men." So they were there, they saw it all, they knew what had happened. And then jump to verse 11. Some of the guard went into the city, and they told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell the people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if it comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him, and we will keep you out of trouble." So they took the money, and they did as they were directed. And this story has spread among the Jews to this day. See, a lot of people simply ignore the evidence and refuse to believe in Jesus. There was a huge amount of evidence that the chief priests had to hold on, had to look past in order to hold on to their own unbelief. Consider the crowd of 5,000 that Jesus fed with 5 loaves and 2 fish. John 6:41, amazingly, we find out that they grumbled about him because he said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." John 6:42, they said, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? But how does he now say, 'I have come down from heaven'?" This crowd certainly could have believed in Jesus, but they, again, chose not to. They could have focused on Jesus' miraculous works, but they chose instead to focus on his humble origins and his ordinary upbringing. A belief was possible for those Jews, but they refused it. And things have not changed much. We still have powerful reasons for belief in Jesus, and yet many of us still refuse to believe. The identity for Jesus' deity is overwhelming, but in truth, there are really a lot of people who simply don't want there to be a God, if the truth be known. Consider the outspoken atheist Richard Dawkins, a former professor of biology at Oxford University over in Britain. He admits that life developing on its own from non-living matter is very unlikely. But rather than say, "Hey, you know what? This life couldn't have come into existence from mud by chance," rather than saying God did it, rather than saying God created life, he says that maybe aliens put life on Earth a long time ago. Of course, you're then left with the question of where those aliens came from. But if you say God is behind it all, if you say God is the author of life, you don't have to ask where God came from, because he's always been here. He never began. So why the refusal to admit there is a God by many? Here's some reasons. For some people, pride gets in the way of belief. Some don't want to think there is a God so much greater than they are. Consider the words of Isaiah 55, verse 8. They don't sit, verses 8 and 9, they don't sit well with people. Where Isaiah speaks the words of God, saying, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Some people don't want those words to be true, Some take the attitude that if in fact there is no God, then I'm the closest thing to him. If there is no God, then I'm about the best that there is. An interesting example of somebody who just doesn't want there to be a God is, by his own admission, Thomas Nagel is a professor of philosophy from New York, or he was a professor of philosophy from New York University, and he wrote a book called The Last Word, and in it he says something I just think is fascinating. He says, I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. To me, that explains, those words are representative, I believe, of many people's thoughts. People, in many cases, aren't willing to accept the demands that Christ makes for loyalty and obedience. Years ago, Richard Dawkins also launched an ad campaign. He put signs around England, I believe, on the sides of buses carrying the slogan, "Relax and live your life, there's probably no God." What's he implying? He's implying that a life of faith is a ball and chain, a source of anxiety, a source of sorrow, a source of repression. For a lot of folks, taking up their cross and following Jesus faithfully all the way to death sounds like too great of a demand. There are a lot of people who don't realize that what Jesus really offers is freedom from the slavery of sin. There's a lot of people who don't realize that what Jesus really offers is hope for eternity and unquenchable joy and peace. Following Jesus sounds like a burden for a lot of folks. So many who don't like the message of Christ reject the messenger instead. Jesus offers us eternal life in the presence of God in exchange for nothing more than our obedient faith, believing that Jesus is who he says he is, believing that Jesus did what he said he would do, trusting Jesus enough to do what he's called us to do. There is powerful evidence to base belief in Jesus on. And if we're willing to accept the implications of God's existence, if we're willing to accept his greatness, if we're willing to submit to his lordship over our lives, if we're willing to choose to acknowledge the evidence, if we're willing to choose to believe, then we're willing to choose life, and we're willing to choose great blessings.